So in the last episode, I explained what deep sky astrophotography is, and which involves collecting a light for as much time as possible. But here's the problem. The Earth spins once every 24 hours. And because of this, the stars appear to move across the night sky. So when you try to collect light for long periods of time, your image would look like this. So that's why the tracking mount is very important for astrophotography. The tracking mount, it rotates around one axis, which we call the right ascension axis. And it rotates at the same speed as how the Earth rotates to offset the Earth's rotation. And because of this rotation of the tracking mount, your stars will become this. However, for this to work, the axis of the tracking mount needs to point in the same direction of the Earth's rotation axis. So what is polar alignment anyway? So in simple words, it means pointing the tracking mount's rotational axis to the Earth's rotational axis. But how do we even find where's Earth's rotational axis? So let me show you where the Earth's rotational axis is. How do you find the Earth's rotational axis? So this is Stellarium, which is a software, a star map software that you can use to see what it is present in the night sky in real time. You see here, it shows the real time. Well, let me just fast forward from daytime to night. And let me turn on some constellation labels and lines. So here, it shows you, well, today is the 10th. So, for example, here, it shows you what constellations are present and visible in the night sky today at night. So, and to find the Earth's rotational axis, well, first, we're in the Northern Hemisphere. So at least I am in the Northern Hemisphere. So first we have to look to the direction north. Well, if you're Southern Hemisphere, of course you look at south. So let me just stop the view in here. Oops. So let me focus on the view in here. And let's see what happens when I fast forward the time. Here. So did you kind of notice all the stars from when I fast forward the time? It appears to rotate around a point in here. Then we do it backward and forward again, so that you can see what I mean. You see it kind of rotates around this point here. So this point is the north celestial pole, which is where the Earth's rotational axis is. So So here, this is where your tracking mount needs the rotational axis of your tracking mount needs to be pointing at in order to do a polar alignment. And in the Northern Hemisphere, the best reference we can use Polaris or the North Star as a reference to do polar alignment. And to find where Polaris is, what I found the most useful is to look for the constellation Ursa Major, or in other words, the Big Dipper. So you see Ursa Major is here. You can use these 4 stars and at the top left, and then draw an imaginary line from this star to the left. Then you eventually find Polaris, which is the North Star, and which is where you want to point your tracking mount's rotational axis to in order to do a polar alignment. And if you're in a darker sky, then you might be able to distinguish the star pattern of Ursa Minor. And in this case, it will be a lot more easier for you to find the North Star Polaris as well. Now, if you've done any star trails photography or you've seen a photo of star trails, then you realize that all the stars appears to move in a circular motion, and there is a center of rotation there, which is where your tracking mount needs to be pointed to in order to do a polar alignment. And that center of rotation is also called the Northern Celestial Pole, or the North Celestial Pole. Well, that is if you face north. And I do want to clarify, this polar alignment tutorial only applies to those living in the Northern Hemisphere, and some of the stuff, it doesn't apply to those in Southern Hemisphere. Now, polar alignment is a very important step. Now, think about it as like aligning wheels. Obviously, let's say if you're riding a bike, if let's say the front wheel or the back wheel is a bit tilted, like slightly misaligned, what happens is it's going to wobble. And the same thing happens to tracking mount, is that if let's say the front wheel is the Earth and the back wheel is the tracking mount, and they're not aligned, of what happens is it's gonna wobble. And the wobble means that the stars isn't going to be pinpoint in your image, because you've got this discrepancy between the direction of the Earth's rotational axis and the direction of the tracking mount's rotational axis. Now I've explained what it is we're trying to do with polar alignment. Let me show you how to do it. Now, first, this tracking mount, it rotates like this, yeah, to offset the Earth's rotation. So if you imagine drawing a line here, so this line needs to be pointed to the North Celestial Pole. Now we're not trying to aim directly at Polaris. We're actually aiming at the North Celestial Pole. So it's a little bit of a different than Polaris, but Polaris is going to be important as a reference point to point at the North Celestial Pole. And this tracking mount has built-in polar scope, and we're going to need this polar scope when doing an accurate polar alignment. Now, before you take it out at night to do polar alignment, what you need to do first is make sure the polar scope is in focus. And you can do this during the daytime by just looking at a distant object via the polar scope, and you rotate this knob until the object you see through the scope is in focus. And secondly, make sure the polar scope, the polar reticle inside is calibrated. Now, when you look through the polar scope, you're gonna see a reticle which has a crosshair, like there's a circle and then with a crosshair in the middle. Like, make sure that crosshair is calibrated. I'm not gonna dive deep into how to calibrate the polar scope. It's very technical, but if you don't know how to, then this tracking mount comes with an instruction manual. Then it has all the details about how to do it. Before we do a polar alignment, I would strongly recommend you download a mobile app. It is like, I would recommend the SAM console app, because this app is going to be super useful to fine-tune your polar alignment. Assuming you've done the focusing of the polar scope and is well calibrated, what we need to do first, when we set up, we're gonna set our latitude adjustment here so that it's set correctly to our local latitude. So this is the latitude adjustment screw. You screw it so that the dial here is correct. So the dial, this adjustment needs to be set at our local latitude. For example, if your local latitude is, let's say, 52 degrees north, then you gotta set it until it's at 52. If you don't know what your local latitude is, just Google it. Let's say, like, just Google it, your city, your country, and then you know what your local latitude is. After it's set, the local latitude, what we're going to need to do is make sure the bubble level is fairly good. Like, I say fairly good, it doesn't need to be super accurate. Like, it doesn't need to be exactly level. As long as it's fairly level, then you can move on. Here's the most important part now. What we're going to need to do is we need the tracking mounts to be facing north. Now that only applies to if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. So you gotta point the tracking mount north, and then we're gonna need to find Polaris. So again, if you struggle, then find the Big Dipper first and then locate Polaris. This works no matter if you're in the dark sky or light polluted sky. So after you've found Polaris, what we need to do is we're gonna adjust the mount. Like, you can grab the tripod and rotate it and move. So that now this step we're going to only do a rough adjustment first. So you're gonna move left, right, or whatever it is until you see Polaris center up just over the top of the tracking mount. After that, when you see Polaris center up just over the top of the mount like this, we're gonna need to use the polar scope. We're gonna need to look through the polar scope to fine-tune the adjustment. And this is where you need the SAM console app. Because when you click on the app and then you click on the polar clock utility section, it's going to show you where to place Polaris inside the polar scope in order to do the accurate polar alignment. And now we need to look through the polar scope, and now if you have center Polaris over the top of the tracking mount, I can guarantee that it's going to be in the field of view of the polar scope. Now of course, we'll be doing this at night, so it will be way harder to see the polar reticle when you look through the scope. So that's why before you fine-tune the polar alignment, you should either flash the red light over here, or if you have like something like this is like a 3D printed illuminator, then you place it and then you shine your torch over it, then it will illuminate the polar scope, and that you can see the polar reticle at night. So after I've shined it with a torch, and now I look through the polar scope, then I can see where Polaris is through the scope, and also the polar reticle. If you don't know where to place Polaris in the app, it's going to help you. So open the app and see where you should place Polaris at a given time in relation to the polar reticle. Then you gotta look through it while adjusting these screws here. So this one, when you rotate it, it moves left or right, and this one, the latitude adjustment screw, is going to move up or down. So repeatedly move these screws around until you see Polaris, like through the polar scope, you see Polaris is sitting onto the circle where it needs to be in order to do the polar alignment. So when you see Polaris like inside the polar scope, well, when you see Polaris is sitting onto it, the certain point on the circle where it needs to be as set via the app, then you've nailed it. You've done a polar alignment. And I want to touch on some important points here. So now, first, the accuracy of polar alignment depends on the focal length you're shooting at. If you're shooting at a shorter focal length, it's more forgiving in terms of the accuracy of polar alignment. So if you're shooting at wide angle, like a 14 millimeter or like 15 millimeter lens, then you don't need to do a super accurate polar alignment. As soon as you've done a rough polar alignment, like you've made a Polaris visible in the field of view somewhere inside the polar scope, that would be fine. You'll be able to do long exposure without star trails, with a wide angle lens, with only a rough polar alignment. But as you increase the focal length, if you're going to be using a long telescope with, let's say, a few hundred, like mine using like 400 millimeters focal length, the polar alignment has to be super accurate. So, and also, right, for in this demonstration, I'm doing the polar alignment with nothing attached on, no telescope, no camera, nothing attached on. And as soon as I attach a camera or a telescope here, this is going to throw off the polar alignment. Now, if you're only going to be attaching a wide angle lens, then even if it throws off the polar alignment a little bit, you don't have to worry too much about it. As I said, wide angle lens or short focal length tend to be more forgiving. But if you attach a long focal length telescope or zoom lens, you always want to double check the polar alignment before you start your imaging session. And also another thing is, once you've done the polar alignment, don't move the tripod or move the mount or whatever, because if you do, you're going to need to do the polar alignment again. Now I've attached my telescope onto the tracking mount. Now I want to talk about balancing. Balancing is also an important step besides polar alignment. Why is balancing important? Well, as you know, the tracking mount is very important because it rotates to offset the Earth's rotation. And the way it rotates is via motor gears. But they aren't magic. Like a tracking mount is actually a motor that is pushing weight. If the weight is uneven, then the motor is going to struggle. So balancing means the weight distribution of your rig is evenly distributed. Because right now, you can see when I let go and loosen the clutch, it's gonna fall, you see? It's gonna tip over, which means it's not balanced. And if you don't go and balance your rig before you start imaging, and the motor is going to strain if your rig is unbalanced like this. Because like if it's unbalanced, your motor is going to be fighting gravity, and this is not going to work. The tracking will not be smooth. So to balance, so how do we do about this? Well, there are actually two axes where you need to balance. So you need to balance the right ascension axis, which is this, and also you also need to balance the declination axis, which is this. Now let's focus on balancing the right ascension axis first. So now before that, I'm gonna lock the declination axis clutch first. So you see, when I let go, it's moving downward like this. So which means this side is way too heavy. And what we'll need to do is we need to move this counterweight up and down. So if this side is too heavy, so what we'll need to do is, look, when I let go, it's moving down on this side. So this, which means the telescope part is way too heavy. So what we'll need to do is we're going to move the counterweights down. But now you see, I'm moving it too much. Now the counterweight is way too heavy. So just adjust the counterweight up or down until if I let go, like, okay, so here, if I let go, you see it's not moving up or down, then that way you can tell it's balanced. No, but it's just only balanced on the right ascension axis. Yeah. So if you balance like this, when you let go, it doesn't move, then this will ensure the tracking is going to be smooth. But of course, it's not just the right ascension axis that you need to deal with. So you also need to balance the declination axis by moving the telescope either forward or backward like this. Yeah. So that is why, right, if you are using the Star Adventurer 2i, like this specific tracking mount, I would recommend you buying an Arcus Swiss clamp like this, so that it gives you room for your telescope or lenses or whatever imaging optics that you might have, that it gives you room to move up or down to balance the declination axis. So now, to balance the declination axis, what I would recommend is first you move your telescope, like rotate your telescope to roughly the direction of the object that you want to photograph. Let's say you want to photograph a specific galaxy or nebula, then point it roughly to where it should be, and then we just let go. You see, like, it's moving down, right? So this shows you, if it's pulling down, when you let go like this, it shows you that the telescope is front heavy. So what you need to do is you gotta slide the telescope backward a bit to even out the weights between the first half and the latter half. And after that, let go again. But now it's back heavy, you see? It's tipping at the back. So adjust again. So now it's still too heavy. So I'm gonna adjust. So you wanna adjust till nothing moves when you let go. So like this. Okay, it's still moving a little bit, but I'm slowly getting there. I'm gonna push up a bit so that the back is less heavy. Now I let go. Well, in this case, I didn't see any problem, does it? It doesn't move, right? Like after I let go, nothing moves. So this is it. If you let go, the telescope's not moving up or down, then you've done the balancing. Well, one important tip is, especially if you're using a lightweight load, you don't need perfect balancing. So, but if you start using heavier telescopes, then balancing will become more critical. And don't forget, after balancing, double check the polar alignment before you start imaging. Polar alignment and balancing, they are two of the most important steps. It's like 80% of astrophotography. Now, I've seen a lot of people getting this wrong, like polar alignment and balancing, getting all these wrong earlier on and blaming their equipment. Well, take the time to practice these two steps before attempting to photograph anything. Yeah, it's gonna take a patience and practice to be able to master the steps of polar alignment and balancing. So I'll always encourage you to practice these steps, like practice balancing at home, and during a clear night, just practice pointing at Polaris and practice finding Polaris and pointing your tracking mount to the North Celestial Pole. And remember, the tracking mount is not magic. It doesn't know where the sky is until you polar align it. And also, the motor it can't push a badly balanced load. So if it's unbalanced, then it's not going to track smoothly, and you will get elongated or star trails, and you're not going to get pinpoint stars. So that's it for polar alignment and balancing. And remember, these are not about perfection. These are about giving your tracking mount the best chance to do its job. And to simply put, polar alignment is about telling the mount where to rotate. And balancing is about ensuring your mount rotates smoothly. And if you've ever found yourself thinking this isn't working, then 9 out of 10 is about polar alignment and balancing, and it's not about your equipment. So be sure to double check polar alignment and balancing before you move on, because once you've aligned and balanced, everything becomes so much easier. And so we can move on to the next step. And this is what I will be talking about in the next video. We've done the hard stuff of polar alignment and balancing, and we are moving on to the fun stuff of how to find your deep sky object and how to focus. My name's Nick. Thank you so much for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next video.